Hello, everyone. It's very great that I'm here. Last year I volunteered for Horizons, and I am really excited to be here as a speaker this year. All right, so let's get started. We have a lot to talk about. Essentially, I'm going to do a brief overview of the past of international clinical research that we've been doing, as well as the present trials that we've been working on based on what we've learned, and kind of projecting into the future for you what's going to happen in phase 3 studies and also the post-approval world. All right. So here's a very abbreviated timeline of the history of MDMA. I'm going to focus on MDMA mainly because that's our primary initiative right now. Because MAPS is a nonprofit, we have to focus our resources, and MDMA is our star leader right now. But we are also working on other psychedelics, and so those are in the sidelines. But who knows what will happen in the future. All right, so Dr. Alexander Shulgin, rediscovered MDMA in the 70s, and as many of you know, kind of introduced it to the therapy community. And Dr. Shulgin and Dave Nichols published a paper in 1978 introducing the effects in a psychotherapeutic context of using MDMA. So shortly after, in 1980, Dr. Shulgin kept trying to work with the FDA and to work with anybody who was interested in working with the FDA to essentially start doing official kind of clinical research, which I'm going to go over how you do that with the FDA in a second. And he couldn't find anyone to take this kind of compound and run with it. And the main reason was that it was off patent. So Merck had synthesized MDMA back in 1912, and the patent had run out since then. Right, so then George Greer and Requia Tolbert, who were therapists, they essentially started working with MDMA in a therapeutic context. They introduced it to patients, and they weren't doing kind of randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. However, they were, compiling initial subjective data, and which was crucial for developing the field. And essentially between 1980 and 1985, they saw many, many patients, and they also followed a very kind of regimented process of doing informed consent, which many of you researchers are familiar with, where you inform subjects about the possible risks and benefits. And essentially, they published their data in 1986, and they were not really doing these randomized placebo-controlled trials, and so that was a major point of criticism of their work. However, Rick Doblin, who is also heading the initiative of MAPS, told me that essentially they kept trying to get FDA to approve protocols. I think they submitted 7 or 8 protocols to the FDA during that period, all the way up to 1987, and FDA kept rejecting efforts to start, FDA-approved style trials. So, the DEA and the FDA basically decided to do an emergency scheduling of MDMA in 1985, and soon after it was officially placed in Schedule 1 in 1986, and that's when MAPS started. Right. So, in your timeline, you'll see that there's a kind of shortened line there that encompasses quite a few years where no clinical research was even possible because everybody was really worried that MDMA had high abuse potential, that people were, going to just take it for fun and not really thinking of it as a psychotherapeutic adjunct, which is how we see MDMA. So in 1992, FDA had a dramatic shift in its policy, and in large part this was because of many doctors and researchers who put their careers on the line and really spoke out in favor of doing research with MDMA. And in 1992, there's this clandestine meeting with FDA, essentially, where they agreed to put science before policy. So from that point onward, we start seeing these studies kind of popping up in our timeline. So Dr. Charles Grob at UCLA did a phase 1 study that was published in 1996 where he was essentially looking at cardiovascular effects. And in the meantime, what I'm not showing here are all the other researchers that have been kind of doing MDMA research that's been funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA. Dr. Grob worked with MAPS to develop the protocol that is shown here. So essentially, MDMA was being intensely studied as a drug of abuse during the time that MAPS was trying to study it as a drug with potential benefits in the therapeutic setting. So essentially, the phase 1 clinical trials that we speak of, which I'm going to also go over in a second, were happening during that time. So in 1999, FDA agreed to do a proof of principle study that was going to be studying the effects of MDMA for a specific indication. So this is kind of a pivotal point because, if you're talking about a drug of abuse and all of a sudden you change it to speaking of using it to treat a disease or a disorder, that's a dramatic shift in the way that the FDA started thinking about MDMA. So from that point onward, the rest of the studies shown here are MAPS sponsored studies that were phase 2 pilot studies. So we have our very first phase 2 pilot study in Spain. It started in the year 2000 with Dr. Jose Carlos Busso. And soon after, the US FDA approved our first phase 2 pilot study in the US in 2001. However, after that period, it took about 2 years for us to actually obtain approval from institutional review boards, or IRBs, which are committees that are made up of volunteers who are charged with protecting human subjects from potential deleterious effects of enrolling in clinical trials. So basically, none of the IRBs wanted to touch this stuff. They were really worried. They had heard about it in the media, but being a party drug. They'd heard about it from researchers of NIDA who had been cataloging their physiological effects, and so all the volunteers on these committees were concerned. And finally, we found an IRB who was actually interested in reviewing the protocol for the merits and the safety procedures that we had put in place in the protocol to deal with people's concerns. And you'll also see up there that the Riccardi retraction coincides with the IRB approval in 2003. So who is Riccardi? Riccardi is one of the NIDA researchers who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who essentially did a study in primates, supposedly with MDMA, and found that it can have extreme dopaminergic effects that can lead to Parkinson's-like symptoms. And all of a sudden, the media took this and ran and said that MDMA can cause Parkinson's, and that's all bad. Nobody wants Parkinson's. So, but soon after, it became apparent, along with the Freedom of Information Act that MAPS had filed, that they actually had used methamphetamine instead of MDMA and given the primates methamphetamine. So the paper was retracted, of course, soon after that, even though in the retraction they said, it's still kind of possible that MDMA could have bad effects. So kind of trying to get the last word in there. But essentially the paper was retracted, and as a result, that freed us to work with the IRBs to get our approvals and to actually start our studies. So from that point onward, so we started the US study in 2003, started a study in Israel that was approved by the Ministry of Health in 2005, started a study in Switzerland in 2006. I'm going to go over the results of the US and the Swiss study a little bit today. And then we were off to the races, essentially doing these phase 2 pilot studies, trying to learn what we can learn in a randomized placebo-controlled style, where our results would be accepted by thinkers in the field, hopefully, or criticized, and then we can at least deal with their criticisms in a scholarly manner. So our US study ended in 2008 with its last MDMA treatment, and then we added a portion to the study where we collected follow-up data. And the results of the US study were published last year, or approved last year, and then in print at the very beginning of 2011 in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. And our Swiss study also collected its final follow-up data in 2011 in January. And now the results are currently in preparation for publication. I should also point out that we just finished our final report on the Swiss data yesterday, and it's in the mail as of yesterday to go to Switzerland and soon to the FDA. All right, so what does the FDA recommend for clinical trials? The FDA would like to see that we are randomizing subjects who are enrolled in our clinical trials. The goal here is to ensure that there's no bias in subject selection depending on which condition you assign them to. And so randomization is really important because, even if there is some sort of skew in the people that have been enrolled in a trial, in terms of, some of them may be older, or some of them may be, had a longer duration of PTSD. Essentially, you want all of those factors to be evenly distributed, and randomization helps you do that. So placebo-controlled trials. FDA would like to see placebo-controlled trials, and many people have heard of the placebo in the context of pharmaceutical clinical trials. It's essentially a sugar pill, and what the FDA doesn't really see is that a sugar pill compared to MDMA is quite different, and it's pretty easy to tell the difference based on the effects in people. So we started out, our first US trial was an inactive placebo-controlled trial just to make FDA happy, but from then onward, we're working on optimizing how we do our control groups. FDA would like studies to be blinded. So blinding essentially means that people don't know what they received. So you can have various levels of blinding. You can have subject blinding where the subject doesn't know but the researcher knows. You can have a double-blind study where both the researcher and the subject doesn't know. And what we're finding is that you can have a triple blind, which is essentially where the subject doesn't know, the researcher or the therapist who's directly working with the subject doesn't know. And we've added a third level of scrutiny, which is our independent raters who are actually generating our outcome data, so they don't know the dose either. So we like to call this our triple blind. And some other studies have used this terminology, but we feel like we're pushing the envelope and developing new terminology for the field as well. So pilot studies. Pilot studies, FDA admits, are useful for determining feasibility and for refining procedures. Nobody knows exactly, what the results are going to be when they first design a trial. So it's a good approach to start out with pilot studies. And the definition of a pilot study is essentially that it has a small subject group. So some of our studies have been criticized in the past by some researchers because they consist of 12 subjects or 20 subjects, and it's quite easy to see a skew in the data if you just happen to pick a group of people that essentially fit certain criteria, but they also may all be non-responders, or they may also be great responders. And so it's difficult to tell from pilot studies if you actually have a drug that works. But what it does help with is fine-tuning your method, trying different variables, and most importantly, what pilot studies help with is managing the risk. So when these studies were originally designed, the US study, the Swiss study, when they were originally designed, it was an environment of, essentially researcher paranoia. Everybody thought that the drug was very dangerous, possible neurotoxicity. Who knows, maybe people could get Parkinson's. So essentially, we had to start out with pilot studies because we wanted to manage the risk of giving this drug to people. Of course, what this is discounting is all the recreational use that Dr. Fadiman just alluded to. And so we have millions of people who have taken MDMA or ecstasy, which is still of unknown content, but it might contain some MDMA. So essentially, this is why we work with pilot studies right now, is to fine-tune our variables. So single-site studies. The FDA admits that single-site studies are useful for looking at safety, tolerability, and getting estimates of effect size. Effect size is the difference between your active group and your control group. And so that ratio is really what determines how much leeway you have in terms of the number of people that you can use to the effect of the drug that you can show. So if you have a large effect size, you can get away with having a smaller group of people to show statistically significant results. But if you have a small effect size, like with a lot of the antidepressants that are currently on the market, you have to have really large trials to show some statistically significant data. So this is going to, this is going to become apparent in a second when I show you some of the data. And ultimately, the FDA would like us to establish safety first and then efficacy for MDMA or whatever drug you're working on. And then just to orient you with the phases of clinical trials that I've been referring to. So phase 1 trials are generally done in healthy volunteers. They're used to show that your average person who's healthy, who has a functional metabolism, is not going to have trouble metabolizing this drug. Your phase 2 studies are used to go for an indication. So now we're going to try things in the PTSD population, for example, where they're already starting out with a baseline that contains severe anxiety symptoms, avoidance symptoms where they don't want to think about traumatic events that happened in the past. And so all of these psychological effects can potentially have a greater risk, right? So overall risk management is going to be a recurring theme through my talk. And essentially, so that's why we're in phase 2 right now. We're testing out the effects of the drug for an indication, and this was essentially allowed by the FDA since 2001 with the approval of our first protocol. And then in phase 3 studies, that's where you really go for your numbers. So it's okay to use pilot studies for phase 2 because you're just kind of trying to show that the drug might work. It's sufficient to show trends towards improvement in PTSD symptoms. So you can get away with using smaller subject groups. But in phase 3, that's where you really go for the money results and you really nail your statistical significance. In addition, phase 3 studies are also where you really start sampling a broader population in a traditional pharmaceutical approach. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind that, at different types of people that may have PTSD could have different results in these clinical trials. And so phase 3 is really going to be where we get some really exciting data. Oops, there we go. So the design of our clinical trials is essentially based on a risk management perspective. So what that means is our MDMA or placebo or active placebo sessions are spaced 3 to 5 weeks apart. So we hope that gives people enough time to integrate the experience during the MDMA session and also to deal with any possible adverse events or reactions that may have happened. It gives them time to recover from that. And we've been kind of toying around with 2 versus 3 experimental sessions. And everybody pretty much agrees that 1 probably isn't enough in a therapeutic setting. So another really important hallmark that I'd like to point out is that we have extensive preparation. So Dr. Fadman was speaking of set and setting. This is where you establish that, is in these preparatory sessions. So I know that some of the researchers have been toying around with exactly how many prep sessions you might need. We've gone with 3, and based on feedback from our investigators, 3 could be too many, but if you get a particularly difficult case, it's good. So then we have 3 integrative sessions in between. And so those are, our investigators give us feedback on that, and they say that actually a lot of the processing that is crucial for working with PTSD symptoms happens during the integrative sessions, actually when the subject is not on drug. And that's an important point because essentially exposure to drug on 3 occasions is sufficient to catalyze extreme change for some people. And so that's very different from the pharmaceutical model where people have to take essentially a drug every single day or in the case of microdosing that we were just speaking of, they might have to take it every, for 3 days and then take a break. All right, so another point that we would like to emphasize is that, all these studies are being done in a blinded format, and we do break the blind right there where we say assessment, break the blind. So first we do the assessment, then we break the blind, and then everybody finds out what the people received. And then afterwards, people can go, a couple different routes in our clinical trials. We've been doing an open label segment where they go back through the trial to see if, people that received placebo, do they actually still respond to the full treatment? So this is an important within subject control. So we work with people that have chronic PTSD who are treatment resistant, which means that they've tried drugs, they've tried therapy, it hasn't worked, they haven't received sufficient decrease in their PTSD severity. So it's important to show that, we're showing these changes in people where nothing else has worked, and the people that received placebo still do respond, so they're not especially treatment resistant, and so that's an important control to point out. So then we added long-term follow-ups into our protocols, and what we've been doing here is we've developed internally developed a questionnaire where we assess any lasting, deleterious effects or any lasting benefits. In addition, we've also been assessing drug use. So does participating in an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy clinical trial make people want to run off and go and buy every single ecstasy pill they want and on the street? No, that actually turns out to not be the case. That's not really surprising, because what we've really been working with our subjects is establishing this set and setting. And in the absence of this set and setting, they're not interested in trying the drugs. There's only been one person who actually attempted to try it from our US study, and the feedback was, based on this long-term follow-up questionnaire, that this subject would never try it again because it just wasn't the same. The set and setting was not there. And this is what we're going to go back and tell the FDA. So also speaking of set and setting, this is an example of setting for our MAP studies. So compare this to your sanitary, sterilized hospital bed. As you see, it's important to have an element of comfort and aesthetic beauty in wherever you do these drugs. So I'm just going to jump right to the data, because this is kind of a talk that's going to be more of an overview. So this is results of efficacy looking at PTSD severity using the clinician-administered PTSD scale, or the CAPS. This is a gold standard kind of interview that assesses PTSD severity that's done with a clinician. And the numbers here are, so 50 is our cutoff for what we consider to be diagnostic for PTSD. So if people are above 50, they have PTSD. If people are below 50, they no longer have extreme symptoms that, would make them have to deal with PTSD on a daily basis. And in addition, I want to emphasize that I have error bars on this graph. So error bars are really important because they give you a visual representation of the amount of variation in your data. And you can see that at baseline, there was no difference essentially between MDMA and placebo group. And the error bars are, solidly overlapping. So that means that there's pretty much no difference between the two groups. But then afterwards, so 3 to 5 days after the first MDMA session, the placebo group, had a tiny bit of decrease, whereas the MDMA group, on average, dropped below 50. So this is really important because in a single session, on one day of your life, that can make such a difference, right? But it's also important to point out that this data is an average of, so we have 12 people in the MDMA group, 8 people in the placebo group. So that doesn't mean that every single person necessarily dropped below 50, and that's why it's important to look at the results over time after a couple more sessions. Right, so another thing that I should point out is that we're not just giving people MDMA, right? We're talking about this in the context of psychotherapy. So MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is really what we're going for. It's a drug plus therapy approach It's kind of unusual, actually, for phase 2 pilot studies to be done with this combination approach, because you don't really know if it's just the MDMA or just the therapy that's doing it. However, the US study was done with an inactive placebo, and they also received the same exact type of therapy. So as you can see from the placebo line, there still was some decrease, which means that the therapy alone is somewhat effective. It's just not as effective as MDMA plus therapy. All right, so now this is new data. So this is data from our Swiss study, and I'm going to emphasize the error bars again. So look at the amount of variation that we have in this 12-subject study. It's very difficult to actually draw conclusions when you have such variation in the data. So on average, we do see a decrease in PTSD severity in the full dose group, but all of a sudden we're faced with a lot of variation. And so it makes you really question, what are the differences between the US study and the Swiss study, and why is there so much variation in one group and not the other? Well, like I said earlier, these are all pilot studies. They're small studies, so you really don't know exactly what you're going to get. However, it is also important to note that the full dose group on average had a 15.6 point drop, which is termed to be very good in terms of clinical significance for PTSD trials that were done with conventional antidepressants that are now approved for PTSD treatment. So comparing, apples and apples, or apples and oranges, however you look at it, essentially, we have this 15.6% drop. We have suggestions that we could get statistical significance if we set the study up in a different way, where we had more subjects, where we could minimize those error bars, and then finally get some nice separation like we did in the US study. Right, so in addition, another kind of really crucial difference, among many others, that I'd like to point out is that we did an active placebo for the Swiss study. So what is that? What is an active placebo? It's 25 milligrams of MDMA in the case of this study. So what we're doing is trying to essentially safeguard the blinding of the study by using a very small dose, a microdose, of MDMA, and seeing if that's enough to fool the therapists. So in addition to using this active placebo, what we're doing is we're assessing the guesses of both the subjects and the therapists on what they thought the subject received after the session. So this is a really important point, because many clinical trial designers essentially don't assess the effectiveness of the blind after doing a blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And so this is another one of the areas where we've hoped that we're pushing the envelope, and I know that other researchers at the Hefter Institute is actually where we got the idea, so I want to give them credit. Right, so let's see what else we're doing with this. Right, so we got the active placebo, and we really don't know exactly which dose of MDMA is going to be an effective active placebo, so you'll notice that as I go over the other trials that are currently ongoing, that active placebo dose is going to jump around a little. And also, before we move on, of course, safety first. So even though I talked about efficacy first, so a comparison of the US and the Swiss safety data is really crucial to make. We had no drug-related serious adverse events. So serious adverse events are kind of the big, very, very important thing that you really don't want in your trial, because it essentially is a life-threatening situation that possibly required intervention in order to prevent a life-threatening situation, or required intervention to prevent death. It includes death also among the things that would be considered a serious adverse event. Right, that sounds funny when I actually say it. So the US study had 2 dropouts, and one of them was just due to travel logistics, so we're not too concerned about him, but the other one was due to a relapse of depression. So the Swiss study also had 2 dropouts, and they were both due to an exacerbation of anxiety. So anxiety already exists in this subject population, like I pointed out previously. So what it means is that, and depression is also highly, comorbid with PTSD. So based on some estimates, up to 90% of people who have PTSD are also depressed. And so, it's interesting that the 2 FDA-approved medications to treat PTSD are also antidepressants. So are they treating the depression or are they treating the PTSD? Who knows? And so what we're doing is something entirely different, right? And essentially, I want to point out that there are risks still in the PTSD population that cannot be overlooked. And that's why it's so important to do these clinical trials in a really careful manner with intensive, medical observation, because your average PTSD subject isn't going to go and run off to some rave and pop some pills and be okay, probably afterwards. So, common reactions to MDMA. I just want to emphasize that all drugs have side effects, but what really is a side effect? Essentially, you have to compare the active placebo to you have to compare the full dose to an inactive placebo in order to determine if something is truly a side effect. And so from our Swiss data, we see that insomnia and loss of appetite were reported as severe in both groups, and also that fatigue and insomnia were recurring 7 days after. And with the 125 milligram group, severe tight jaw, anxiety, nausea on the day of the session, and low mood, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating, and an increase in private worries during 7 days after is what we observed. So these are recommendations from the Veterans Administration, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the Department of Defense on how you should design a clinical trial. And it's important to have inclusive subject selection criteria. So you've got to take a broad sampling of your subjects. You need to have clearly defined primary and secondary measures. You have to have a control that's clinically relevant. So in our case, having an active placebo would be a clinically relevant control because we see that it's relevant from the full dose group. And you have to have intensive monitoring of your data quality, and that's where I come in. So I go to the doctors and I say, hey, are you doing the protocol properly? Are you following it to the letter? Because you have to in order for us to stand by this data and report it. We're also working on a treatment manual to standardize how the therapy is done, and we're working on videoing our therapy sessions to assess how well people are following that treatment manual. And we're also working with our independent raters who are generating the data that we show in these slides to work with them and make sure that they're giving the tests in a standardized fashion. Right, so currently we have a vet study that's ongoing. We have enrolled 5 out of 16 subjects, and we're comparing 3 doses. It's triple blind, like I talked about, and we have 3 sessions, and we're analyzing adherence to the treatment manual on an ongoing basis. Israel, we just started a new study. In Vancouver, we're trying. In Jordan, we're also trying. And phase 3 is going to be exciting. Come talk to me about it. And the post-approval world. So essentially what we'd like to work towards is having mental health clinics that are, emphasizing all the safety measures that I was speaking to you ad nauseum, and also working with the DEA to make sure that they have a Schedule I license, if necessary at that point, to really work with people on their mental health issues. And we'd like to broaden our indications from PTSD to autism and onward. Thank you.
Thank you, Berra. Any questions for Berra?
I was wondering if you knew what the drop was. Zoloft and one other medicine has been approved by the FDA to treat PTSD.
Yeah, Zoloft and Paxil.
Do you happen Paxils?
Yeah.
Do you happen to know what the point drop was for the FDA to approve those? Is the MDMA data anywhere near?
A 6-point drop is considered, clinically significant, kind of. 12 points are really good. 15 is even better, right? So they actually had, in one of the trials, they had a 6-point drop. A couple of the trials had difficulty demonstrating that it worked for men. And I should also point out that in both the US study and the Swiss study, our enrollment is primarily women. So that's important to note.
And the MDMA studies have bigger drops than
yes, the MDMA
approved
studies have bigger drops. So the US study, the control group dropped 25 points. The MDMA group dropped about 50 points. Yeah.
That's a testament to Michael and Annie's good therapeutic interventions without the MDMA that your placebo groups are doing so well.
Exactly.
It's not great for the data, but it's good for those patients.
Yeah, conventional talk therapy does work for, 30% or so probably of the PTSD population. And then another 30% responds to drugs. Another 30% doesn't respond to either, and that's who we'd like to work with.
And can you say something about autism? Because I saw a slide about autism. And
Yeah. So autism, MDMA for autism is a new initiative that we're working on. We've been collecting anecdotal reports on, positive and negative effects of MDMA for people who are on the spectrum. We'd like to emphasize that, first off, we want to start out with high-functioning autism, also known as Asperger's. The two will be merged in DSM-5, so when that comes out, we'll need to be more careful about how we word our selection criteria. And we're actually putting out a call for proposals to researchers who are interested in developing a protocol. We have some seed money available for protocol development, and what we'd like to do is work with them to apply to the NIMH, and maybe one day we can establish ourselves as an autism center of excellence, which is what the NIH is working on right now.
Another question?
Thanks, Neil. Berra, very clear talk, very much appreciated. I thought it was very interesting and nice description of the history. Question about the dropouts in the MDMA studies. I know you can't make strong experimental conclusions about this, but any just anecdotal attribution on the part of the participants in terms of whether the dropout was or was not related to the drug session?
Yeah, so in the Swiss study, that's kind of what I want to focus on first. In the Swiss study, one of the subjects who happened to, later on we found out, received full dose MDMA, he essentially had reservations going into the experience at first, and he had obviously multiple traumatic events like many of the PTSD subjects do that we work with. But the investigators reported kind of an unwillingness to process the material, and as a result, it kind of set him up for having an adverse reaction, we think. It was deemed to be related by the investigator to the drug, but it's important to point out that the other anxiety reaction also happened with a 25 milligram active placebo subject. So it's kind of, if you have the same thing happening in one group as well as the other, it's more of a balanced thing and not necessarily attributable to the dose itself. And also, these subjects are suffering from intense anxiety going into these trials. So perhaps more preparatory sessions with this subject could have mediated his feelings going into the session, and then we could have had a better outcome, and he wouldn't have felt like he just had to stop right after. And the active placebo subject who dropped out wanted to drop out because she essentially didn't want to go through an active placebo session again. So this is important because the investigators did report that there were kind of more anxiety-provoking effects of a low dose of MDMA, which is something that we're investigating right now, and we're obviously going to be on the lookout for that. I guess in the sense that our trials are not kind of balanced in the numbers. We have a larger full dose group than we do, and we have a smaller active placebo group. So we're managing the risk in that sense, only exposing a couple people to a possibly anxiety-provoking dose of MDMA. But really, the support of the full dose seems to be a really good thing for many of the subjects.
Other questions?
We got
one up there.
Here.
Are you getting any support or interest from the military in your efforts to treat PTSD?
So there was recently a meeting, by the head of VA and the head psychiatrist of VA and a bunch of the bigwigs, and essentially they decided we were still too controversial. So a single pilot study with 20 subjects is not sufficient to sway them to bet on the winning horse. And so as a result, we don't have monetary support, but we know that they're watching us, which is really important. And after a single study, many people can't really say the same. And also, prominent researchers in the field rated our journal Psychopharmacology article with an 8 out of 10 and said it was a must read. So it's important to note that, everybody's watching in the PTSD field. So it's especially important that, we're very careful with how we do our clinical trials. And it's especially important that we try and meet those, above and beyond style recommendations that go beyond the regulations that the FDA legally can enforce. we're really going for appeasing the scientific community and making like a difference in how straight edge scientists think. So, and possibly scientists who study MDMA as a drug of abuse, like we'd like to change their minds. So, so actually, one thing I'm going to do is the FDA is putting on a controlled substances conference that's on the science of abuse liability assessment. So I'm heading over there representing MAPS, and I'm going to figure out how we can, make MDMA to be considered no longer a drug of abuse. So we'll see how that works.
I was wondering if there was any data between the depressed PTSD patients and the non-depressed PTSD patients in drop rate.
Yeah, so right now we are not in a position to analyze that because essentially in the Swiss study, I know right off the top of my head that 85% of the subjects in the Swiss study were also depressed. And so that's where we really rely on our randomization to kind of make sure that we don't have a randomization error, which means if you have more depressed subjects in one group than the other. So we are not set up to assess whether we have different results in people who are also depressed. Another idea we've been toying around with is requiring that everybody's depressed as well as having PTSD in our trials. And it's actually not that hard of a proposition in this subject population. But in phase 3, when we actually have our bigger numbers, we'll be able to cut the data in all sorts of ways. So we'll be able to look at gender effects. We'll be able to look at effects of comorbidity and figure out if it, certain subject groups respond differently than other subjects.
I've just been wondering, with all the 9/11 survivors in New York City suffering still from PTSD, why nobody's done, or maybe they have they done studies with the MDMA here in New York? I mean, there's been so many. Columbia has had a long-standing program where they're using Paxil, and just wondering what's going on.
Yeah, we haven't been able to set up a trial specifically in New York, but for the U.S. studies, we do recruitment from all over the country. So we basically fly people out to the clinical trial site and pay for all of their travel and lodging and everything. So people from New York are eligible to participate in our studies. We just haven't had anybody that, came up. And of course, now what we're really up against is that, the one trial that we have in Charleston is specific for vets with military service related PTSD, but we also are working on a new U.S. study that I'm going to be writing the protocol for in a month here. And so that trial will basically be all types of PTSD, and it's going to be in Boulder, Colorado. And we're going to be testing out some variables in terms of the makeup of the therapy teams. So we're testing if an intern can work with a therapist. But it's a great proposition. New York, sufferers of 9/11 definitely should apply to be in the trial. It's definitely something we'd love to do. It's just that we're currently trying to work out all the variables, and then we're going to take that data to the FDA based on our small pilot studies, and then say, hey, look, 9/11 sufferers need help too, and they need to enroll in our phase 3 trials. We're actually planning on having a New York site in our phase 3 trials. So, the more support that MAPS can get to that point to enable us to do phase 3 trials, the more likely it is that we can help people in New York.
Yay. Please help me thanking Berra in presenting MAPS research.